Hi friends, I'm Abby and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be doing the Get to Know the Fantasy Reader tag. So if you didn't know already, I'm a massive fantasy reader. It's the genre that I gravitate towards the most and it's where I'm most comfortable. I've been reading fantasy for many years and so here's my history of reading fantasy. This tag was originally made by The Book Pusher, so I will leave that tag down below. So the questions. What is your fantasy origin story? How you came to read the first fantasy novels? So I was thinking back and I have always read fantasy. It's hard for me to think back and remember the very first fantasy book that I read because since I was reading, I've been reading fantasy. So some of the ones that come to mind is the first books that I read. I remember reading The Worst Witch and my mum would be able to answer exactly when she gave it to me. Maybe I was 5. Mum, if you're watching, let us know when I started reading The Worst Witch. But The Worst Witch was it was part of my childhood. I loved that series. I remember loving the books and the TV show and I was obsessed with it as a child growing up. So completely The Worst Witch was definitely one of the first, I guess, middle grade fantasy books that I read, and I read them so many times. Those books that I have are falling to pieces. Additionally, my dad read me The Hobbit and The Fellowship of the Rings and we never finished the trilogy, but he read me The Hobbit as a child, so read it aloud to me a chapter a night before I went to bed, and so I'd say that that was probably very formative in my love of fantasy. I'd say that those were the start of it and then it just kept going from there. Question 2. If you could be the hero or heroine in a fantasy novel, who would be the author and what's one trope you'd insist be in the story? So I am going to get S.A. Chakraborty, who wrote the David trilogy, to write my fantasy novel. I feel I may have some troubling times, but I feel hopefully I'd end up being okay in the end. I think she'd interweave lots of interesting mythology into my story because the David trilogy is set in the Middle East, so I feel as though there'd be lots of interesting mythology. I feel she could give me some magical powers, so I'd have some sort of magic. The food that she describes in that series always sounds really delicious, so hopefully she gives me some nice food to eat because that would be amazing if I'm eating then I'm happy. So it would be very good to make sure that I had food in a fantasy novel. I don't want to starve. And in some worlds people do seem to get very hungry and I don't want to get hungry. So yeah, I feel as though she'd be good. And the one trope you'd insist be in the story. So I would love to have the trope where I discover that I have magic, that I thought I was a normal human being and then suddenly I have magic and I have all these powers. I'd really like that trope to be my story. I mean, I'd love for my story to have a happy ending because I don't want to die in my own story. That would just be, that would not be fun. So those 2 tropes, please. What is a fantasy you read this year that you want more people to read? So I have been making my way through the rest of John Gwyn's works and I've been reading his Of Blood and Bone trilogy. So I would not recommend starting with that, but I would recommend reading Malice by John Gwyn. And I mean, you must be tired of me talking about this series by now because I literally talk about John Gwyn in every video because I love his books. So if you haven't got Malice and The Faithful and the Fallen on your radar yet, I would strongly recommend reading the Faithful and the Fallen series by John Gwyn. It is so good, so good. So I would strongly recommend picking this up. It is an epic fantasy series. You've got multiple POVs spread across this epic world called the Banished Lands. There's battles between different kingdoms. They're inspired by the Celts and the Romans, and there's giants as well. It's there's a prophecy, there's a chosen one, but it's got all these tropes which and they're quite common tropes in fantasy, but you love it anyway. The twists that he has on these common fantasy tropes, and the twists throughout these books and just the emotional impact these have and the way that you feel towards these characters. Oh, I just love this series so much. So I would strongly recommend picking up this series if you have not read it yet. What is your favourite fantasy subgenre? And what subgenre have you not read much from? So I think I read across a wide variety of subgenres within fantasy, that I don't like stick to just one certain thing. Like, I'm pretty widespread. So I'd say that I really do enjoy the fantasy romance subgenre. Like, I really like having a romantic subplot within my fantasy books and having that interwoven into the plot. I'd say I also really enjoy like politically centered fantasy books where there's like court intrigue and there's like balls and there's like there's a wars going on, but you're not necessarily like on the battle. You're not let's say on the battlefield. You are the people that are like behind the wars and like constructing the battles and like coming up with like the tactics behind the battles and like how they can overthrow the enemy through these like sneak tactics, like all of those sort of political machinations, the like surprise twists with the politics. Like, I love that. But yeah, I mean, I'm pretty happy reading like any fantasy book, like any subgenre, so there isn't any that I like really avoid at all. A subgenre that I would like to read more of within the fantasy genre is, I don't really read that much steampunk fantasy, so I'd like to try a little bit more of that. I also would like to try a little bit more grimdark fantasy. So I've read a couple, like I've read the Godblind series by Anna Stevens, and I enjoyed it, but I do get a bit squeamish with all the torture. So there is like a little bit of hesitancy with that. I am keen to try Joe Abercrombie because I've definitely seen his name like floating around BookTube quite a lot. So I would be intrigued to try a little bit more grimdark and see where I fit with that subgenre, because I don't gravitate towards it so much. Who is one of your auto-buy fantasy authors? So I had a thought about this, just to mention one, and you know, I always mention like John Gwynne, Sarah J Maas. Like, we know, Abby, we know that those are auto-buy authors. So to talk about someone else, I thought I would mention Erin Morgenstern, who wrote The Starless Sea and The Night Circus. So she doesn't have that many books out because they take her years and years to write. That I think we're waiting years for this book that came out in 2019. So we'll probably be waiting many, many years for her next book, but when it does come out, I will definitely be buying it because I have loved the Night Circus and The Starless Sea. So I think whatever she writes, I will read and enjoy. And I know that her books do not work for everyone, because I don't think it's her premises. I think her premises could work for everyone, but her writing style is very unique. It's very atmospheric. She definitely interweaves plots together. They're not linear, and it's very atmospheric and beautifully written. And some people don't get along with these at all, but I love them. I love the way these books are written. I love her writing style. I love the way she interweaves her plots and the themes throughout them. So I would definitely buy anything that Erin Morgenstern writes. How do you typically find fantasy recommendations? So I pretty much find all my fantasy recommendations, or all recommendations for any genre in general, on YouTube and BookTube. I watch quite a lot of BookTube videos because I mean, it's what I really enjoy watching, and that's where I find the majority of recommendations for books. That I don't feel as though I like search out books that much by myself. That I don't like avidly search through Goodreads or search through press releases. I literally see what other people are reading and I see what they're recommending to me. Definitely BookTube is where I get the majority of them. And I guess if like authors that I know are coming out with new books, then I will be aware of that and I'll be like on the ball with their new releases. But yeah, finding new authors is definitely BookTube. What is an upcoming fantasy release you're excited for? So I have a whole video where I'm talking about books that are coming out in April, May and June. So that should be up by the time this goes up, which I will link. But thinking of one, The Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne, I am so excited for that book. So excited. I'm also really excited for She Who Became the Sun, which is coming out in the summer. I have an arc for it, so I'm really excited to get to that and give that a try. It was the tagline that completely sold it to me. So it's Achilles meets Mulan, and I'm like, Achilles, Greek mythology meets Mulan? Yes, sign me up. And it's been like compared to the Poppy War, and I really enjoyed the Poppy War, so I really want to see like that. So I'm really excited to get into that. I've not heard many people talk about it yet, so that is one that I'm very, very excited to get into, and fingers crossed it lives up to my expectations that I've set for it. What is one misconception about fantasy you would like today to rest? So I feel as though if you haven't read much fantasy, it could be a little bit daunting to get into it and not knowing exactly where to start, and also sort of the approachability of fantasy. So I think that there's probably a fantasy book for every reader. So whatever genre you generally read, you will be able to find a fantasy subgenre that is like that. So if you generally read contemporary books, you will probably be able to find a fantasy book which reads like a contemporary. Additionally, if you read sci-fi, there'll be ones with sci-fi elements, and thriller elements. You'll be able to find the genres that you normally read within some fantasy books. It's not as daunting as that. Additionally, when you hear about like the traditional fantasy books, a lot of them are really big series, and there are a lot of fantasy books that aren't necessarily in 10+ book series, that you don't have to read these gigantic, really daunting series that are seen as like the benchmark of fantasy to enjoy fantasy. I am not interested in reading a lot of the really big, massive fantasy series, but that doesn't stop me from being a fantasy reader. I read a lot of fantasy, and just because I have no interest in reading Wheel of Time, Malazan, that doesn't stop me from being a fantasy reader. And so I don't think you should feel as though you have to read those books, or you have to read Lord of the Rings to be a fantasy reader. You can get into it in many different avenues and still really enjoy the genre. So this, I guess, leads on to the next question, which is, if someone who had never read fantasy before asked you to recommend the first 3 books that came to mind as places to start, where would you recommend? So this really does depend on the person, I would say, because it's not like one straight answer for every person. That it depends on what your history of reading is and where you're coming into fantasy, and what your grounding blocks are. So I've thought of a few answers, and these are ones that, I mean, I've been reading fantasy all my life, but there was a point, I guess, in 2014 where I really got back into reading a lot of books that I'd always read, but 2014 was like this catalyst where I suddenly read lots and lots and lots. So one of the books that really got me back into fantasy, and I think it's a book that has also helped a lot of other readers get back into fantasy, is Throne of Glass. Now, I know this isn't going to necessarily work for everyone. If you enjoy YA, then I would say this would be a good starting place. I'd say that it does have quite a few of the common fantasy tropes. You're following an assassin. She has been imprisoned, but she has been offered a chance to get out by the king if she becomes the king's assassin. And so she has to go through a competition with other assassins to see who's going to get that position. And it's got like the castle setting. It's set in a fantastical world. There's like magical elements interwoven in. The series does definitely like expand after the first and second book, that it definitely takes a change of pace and definitely becomes a little bit more adult as it goes along. But I would say that if you're a bit anxious about adult fantasy and the epicness of adult fantasy, then I think Throne of Glass is probably quite a good place to start as a like beginner into fantasy. I would also say that if you are wanting adult fantasy, then Brandon Sanderson and his Mistborn series is a great place to start. So I have read a lot of Brandon Sanderson now, but I started with the Mistborn series and The Final Empire. And The Final Empire, although it is the first book in a trilogy, it doesn't matter so much if you don't read the second and third book. I mean, you probably would want to. I mean, I don't know why you wouldn't read the second and third book, but if you're feeling intimidated by the sense of it being a trilogy, and they're all about 600 pages, then The Final Empire could be read as a standalone, and then you could go from there. And it's a very accessible adult fantasy. The writing is very clear and easy to read. If you've been reading mostly YA, then it definitely can like transition you into adult. So I would definitely recommend reading Mistborn. And then the final one, if you are intimidated by series and the concept of there being many books in a series or trilogy, then potentially The House in the Cerulean Sea would be a good place to start. This is a standalone, and I'd say this definitely reads like a contemporary book because it feels like a contemporary in a fantasy setting. That's how I'd describe it. So I would strongly recommend this as a place to start, because this you're just following this care worker who is at an orphanage with magical children. Who is the most recent fantasy reading content creator you came across that you'd like to shout out? So I watch quite a few booktubers that predominantly read fantasy, but the most recent ones that I have discovered and have been really getting into their videos are Brightness Katie Reads. So I discovered her this year, and she seems to read a lot of fantasy, She's just so, well, I guess like her channel says, brightness. She is so bright and bubbly. Like, she just seems to be always smiling. So I would definitely recommend checking out her channel. She seems to read a wide variety of fantasy books and sci-fi books. Also, Books with Brittany I've recently discovered, and I've been really enjoying her videos. She definitely reads some very epic adult fantasy books, and she's making her way through, I think, both Wheel of Time and Malazan. So if you are interested in them and you're not going to get that content here, then definitely go check out her videos. A new booktuber that I've recently discovered is Joanna. So Joanna is one of my great friends. She has the most epic comments on BookTube. Like, you see her comments in videos and you're like, she just seems to, I don't know, the way she engages with videos and the content that she puts out, she puts on other people's videos, you're like, Joanna, thank you so much. But she's just started creating videos herself, and she is very into fantasy and also reading Malazan, and I think she's been reading the Joe Abercrombie books that I am interested in reading. So I would definitely recommend checking out Joanna's channel. So those are all the questions. I hope we have you've got to know this fantasy reader a little bit better. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, comment and subscribe, and I will see you in my future videos. Bye!